It was one of those funerals that just didn't make sense. Scotty Hornickel had played drums with Burton Cummings before Burton got famous. Scotty saw the fame coming before anyone else and he quit. "That's not the life I want," he said. Instead of fame, he opened a little music store. He was the kind of guy you wanted to know. And over the years, everyone went to the store. Deep Purple, Alice Cooper, Ozzy Osbourne, Iggy Pop. David lost track of the nights he had sat around the store talking and listening to musicians jam. Scotty sitting there watching everything philosophically. He's one of those guys you thought would go on forever. The funeral was just what you would have expected. There was a doo-wop band and a 6'8", 120-pound Wayne Newton impersonator. He looked ridiculous, but he sure could sing Dankeschön. It was after the service, when a fog of sadness had settled upon him. It was after the service, while Dave was staring vacantly into his cup of coffee, that Austin Shoup emerged out of the fog. Shoup, a bald man with bad clothes and earrings in both ears, looked at Dave and said, "Dave, geez, I didn't know you were still around. Someone told me you were dead." It was a melancholy drive home. Dave put on a George Harrison tape and brooded his way through the night. My Sweet Lord, all those years ago. The music didn't make him feel any better. It was 2 weeks later when Austin Shoup called Dave at work. "I've been thinking about you," he said. "I teach at the university, you know." Dave didn't know. "Ethnomusicology," said Austin Shoup. "Pop culture, the 60s. Anyway, Scotty used to come to my class every spring and talk to the kids. And now, well, being dead and everything, he isn't going to be available this year. And I was thinking you could take his place." Dave didn't go to university. When the kids he grew up with were going to university, Dave headed out on the road instead. He stayed there for 15 years, working as a technical director, road manager, and tour organizer for many of the biggest acts in the music business, certainly some of the craziest. It was a decision he had never questioned, not seriously, not until his daughter Stephanie left for college last fall. When Stephanie headed out to have this experience that he had never had, Dave began for the first time ever to wonder about the choice that he had made. And that sneaky, most unanswerable of all questions raised its nagging head, the what-if question. The call from Austin Shoup made Dave feel good. His experience obviously counted for something. The life he had constructed was obviously not unimportant in the world of academe. As soon as he hung up the phone, however, he had second thoughts. Now, why did I agree to that? Dave hated public speaking. Didn't mind speaking one-on-one, especially if he was speaking to people he knew. But if he was in the spotlight, if he was asked a question in front of others, the moths of anxiety always began their dance. Giving this speech was a big deal. Dave began to prepare 3 weeks before he was scheduled to visit Austin Shoup's class. He began by writing out his ideas on index cards. He decided he'd begin by talking about his friend Scotty. Dorothy, who runs Wordsworth's Books just down the street from Dave's record store, bought him a out-of-date Toastmasters pamphlet on public speaking. She meant it as a joke. As soon as she left, Dave read it from cover to cover. There was a section on lazy lips. Booklet said you should be able to wrap your lips around each word of your speech as if it was a tasty morsel. There was a series of lip exercises for stiff lips. Dave began the lip exercises, stretching his lower lip over his upper lip, and then stretching the upper lip down over the lower one, alternating with increasing rapidity, humming while he did it. He did the exercises whenever the store was empty, sitting behind the counter with his booklet in his lap, rounding his lips tightly as it advised, grooving his tongue and pushing it through the opening as fast as he could. More than once, he was so caught up in these oral isometrics that he didn't notice someone come into the store. More than once, a customer had come in and caught him sitting there with his tongue flicking in and out, his eyes crossed as he tried to follow it. They always left without announcing themselves. He came home one evening and he told Morley that over half of all human communication takes place on a non-verbal level. This is documented, he told her, by research. Smile at the audience, he wrote. Select one person in the crowd and talk to them personally. He underlined one person 3 times. And gestures. He should gesture. All good speakers use gestures. He stood in front of the bathroom mirror at night trying out various gestures, holding out his hands, palm up at shoulder height. That implied openness. He put together a bag of his favorite records, the only album ever released by the International Submarine Band, Graham Parsons' first country rock group, a copy of the ultimate cult album Forever Changes by the doomed psychedelic group Love, a 45 RPM recording of the Nancy Sinatra-Lee Hazelwood duet Some Velvet Morning, a song that his friend Richie Underberger believed might be the strangest song ever to enter the top 40. The night before he was supposed to leave, he went upstairs into the attic to get a suitcase. He came downstairs grinning gleefully in a Grateful Dead t-shirt, a leather vest, and a pair of bell-bottom jeans with embroidered cuffs. The pants were not, unfortunately, done up at the waist. Because my hips are bigger, he said. I'm hipper than I used to be. He didn't look hipper than he used to be. He looked like Homer Simpson, ready to sneak out for Halloween. Morley stared at Dave's belly looming over his jeans like a meteorite. She was thinking, I remember those jeans. But she looked so distressed, so horrified, so defeated, so beyond speech that Dave didn't wait for her to answer. I'm just joking, he said uncertainly. But he wasn't joking. He was holding his all-time favorite poncho behind his back, fashioned from a gray blanket. Seriously, he said, how do you think I should dress for this? Like an adult, said Morley. He arrived on the campus 4 hours before he was scheduled to give his talk. The auditorium was bigger than he had expected. He'd been thinking classroom. He'd been thinking grade 6. This was more of a theater. It was 3/4 full when he arrived. Backstage, Austin Shoup introduced him to a fussy young man. I'm doing audio, he said. Where's your disc? Dave stared at him blankly. You're not doing PowerPoint, he asked incredulously. Dave looked at Austin Shoup in confusion. Am I, he asked. Just a microphone, Dwayne, he said. Shoup took Dave by the arm and led him to a small group of students standing by the Coke machine. My committee, he said. It's so good of you to come, said a well-scrubbed girl in a bright yellow sweater. It's so important for us to hear about the 60s before everyone's passed away and everything's forgotten. A second girl leaned forward. We imagine you may not want to stand for the whole thing, she said. We have a chair for you on stage in case you want to sit while you talk. Austin Shoup, now at the podium, was not making him feel any better. Dave was sitting in his easy chair in the middle of the stage, and mostly he was not understanding one word of what Austin Shoup was saying. Something about upcoming lectures, something about the process of canon formation and the contemporary understanding of musical meaning. Shoup was in full academic flight. He was on about semiotic and critical theory and the neo-republicanism of Elton John. And now Madonna, who he was describing as a postmodern goddess of commodification who had proclaimed the long-awaited emergence of matriarchy and the decay of the fallen Western male-dominated post-war, post-industrial world. Dave glanced at his speech nervously. He was doing his best to look as if he understood what Austin Shoup was saying, but he wasn't understanding. He wasn't even trying to understand, because a horrible thought had occurred to him. What if, when it was his turn, he went to the lectern and he froze? What if his mind went blank? What if when he got to the podium and opened his mouth, nothing came out? It had happened once to his son, his own flesh and blood. Sam had stood on stage at a spring recital. Stood and stood and stood, and then into the immense and awful silence that had settled over the auditorium, he had said one small word. He had said, "Sorry." And then he'd walked off stage. What if it was genetic? Dave's reverie was interrupted when he heard a ripple of polite applause, and he looked up and he realized Austin Shoup was staring at him. He looked around uncertainly. There was some uncomfortable laughter. He looked back at Austin, who was nodding, and Dave stood up and took a tentative step toward the podium. He looked like he was being led to his execution. He set his notes down awkwardly, and then he began to look for his glasses, patting his pockets. He found them and he leaned forward and he gripped the podium stiffly with both hands. And now there was dead silence in the hall. And he grimaced and he cleared his throat and he sighed heavily and he began reading. "It's a great pleasure to be here this evening," he said, unconvincingly. Of course, that's not what the audience heard him say. They heard him say, "I'd rather have a needle in my eye than go any further." "It's a great pleasure to be here this evening," he said again, gripping the podium with all his might. And then he remembered what he had practiced, and he leaned forward and he squinted out at the audience. He was looking for someone with whom he could make eye contact. There was a shuffling like the wind as people looked away uncomfortably. And he couldn't catch anyone's eye. And he felt the stirring of anxiety in his stomach, and then he spotted the girl in the yellow sweater. And when their eyes met, the girl swallowed nervously. But Dave felt a sense of relief. He looked down at his speech and then back at the girl, and he began again. "It's a great pleasure to be here tonight," he said, for the third time. There was some nervous laughter at the back of the hall. But Dave didn't hear it. Dave was thinking, the first couple of minutes set the tone for the whole speech. Dave was thinking, if I screw up here, I'm going to spend the rest of this speech thinking about what I should have said at the beginning instead of thinking about what I should be thinking. And Dave knew if that happened, his brain could go into a split, and then that could only lead to disaster. And that's when he noticed his hands, which were gripping the podium so tightly his knuckles had turned white. He looked out to see if the girl in the yellow sweater had noticed. He looked at her so plaintively that she nodded at him. She was trying to be encouraging. He misunderstood. He thought she was telling him, "Yes, I see them too." And suddenly his hands felt like big clown hands, like swollen, white-gloved cartoon hands. Hands 2 times too big for his body, spatula hands. And he had to get them out of sight before everyone noticed them. And he started to inch his hands slowly off the podium. And as he did this, he realized that his arms didn't feel like his own arms anymore. They felt like penguin wings rather than arms. Big, flapping penguin wings with his swollen hands stuck on the end, sliding down the podium as if they had a mind of their own. And it was while Dave was watching them move and wondering where they might be heading that it suddenly occurred to him that he'd already begun his speech. He looked down and he saw he was, in fact, on page 6. Words had been, and in fact were still coming out of his mouth, though he had no idea whatsoever what he was saying. He'd been too busy thinking about his spatula hands to pay attention. And now he heard himself talking and his voice sounded peculiar to him. It didn't sound like his voice. It sounded like someone doing a not very good imitation of his father. Which is when he noticed he had reached the bottom of the page. He turned the page quickly so no one would notice his big fat cartoon hands. And he began reading at the top of the other side of the page. And he was a third of the way down before he realized that he had been there before. He had turned back to page 5 instead of on to page 7. So he said sorry and he flipped the page over and started down page 6 for the second time. Not noticing what he had done because he was too busy looking at the girl in the yellow sweater, who had stopped nodding and begun to frown, which is when Dave remembered what he was supposed to do with his hands. He was supposed to make gestures. And he thought, where are my hands anyway? And he began to pat himself down, looking for his hands the way he looked for his glasses. And he thought, isn't that silly? And that is the precise moment when his mind clicked over. Dave had been reading the words on the pages in front of him mechanically while he fretted privately about everything else. Now, unbeknownst to Dave, deep in his brain a synapse misfired, some wires crossed, and he began reading his speech silently and speaking out loud the inner dialogue that was running through his head. And what was running through his head at that moment that the wires crossed were the instructions about breathing. Breathe easily and at a natural pace, he said to the startled class. If you're using a microphone, it's especially important to be careful that your breathing sounds aren't taken up by the mic and magnified to your audience. Students began to glance at each other uncomfortably. Except for a boy in the first row, an engineering student who was taking Austin Shoup's course as an elective and had been mystified by everything Austin Shoup had said. This boy began to nod earnestly. This was the first thing that had made sense all year. He opened his notebook and began taking notes. Dave was so totally focused on the girl in the yellow sweater that he had no idea what he was doing. And the expression of alarm that he read on her face wasn't helping. The look of horror on her face had activated Dave's adrenal glands. His heartbeat was quickening. His breathing was becoming shallower and more rapid. His muscles were becoming tense. Dave was scaling a summit of anxiety that he had never visited before. A body will do almost anything to rid itself of tension. Dave began to sway back and forth, rocking from side to side, his head moving around the hall like an oscillating fan, his right hand jerking up and down. Dave thought he was making emphatic gestures with his hand, except these gestures had nothing whatsoever to do with what he was saying. They looked random and furtive. The arm movements made him feel more comfortable, though, and Dave thought maybe I should switch positions. And he leaned into the mic and he said, if you change your speaking position during a speech, you should always lead with the foot nearest your destination. The boy in the front row nodded earnestly and wrote this down carefully. But Dave wasn't looking at the boy in the front row. Dave was staring at the girl in the yellow sweater, and the more he focused on her, the more anxious she got. This maniacal speaker waving his hands and weaving back and forth and saying all these crazy things was talking directly to her. If you're going to step to your left, lead with your left foot, said Dave. Never cross one foot over the other when you begin a movement. And when Dave said that, his arm jerked violently up into the air. And that's when his watch flew off his wrist. It sailed over 10 rows and landed in the lap of the girl in the yellow sweater. And she screamed in horror. "Not me," she screamed. "I'm only 18. That was more or less the end of the formal presentation. After people settled down, after the girl in the yellow sweater had been taken to the counseling offices, after some semblance of order had returned to the hall, Austin Shoup suggested Dave might agree to answer questions. Dave nodded, and a hand shot up into the air. It was the engineering student in the front row. "Excuse me, sir," he said, flipping through his notes frantically. "Which leg did you say you led with?" After the rest of the questions, mostly about music, a small group of students gathered around Dave. A young man with a soul patch, wearing army surplus pants and a V-neck blue sweater, looked at Dave and said, "That was incredible, man." "Do you want to go for a beer?" A beer was just what Dave needed. They went to the student pub, and then about 10 of them went back to the boys' room because he had a turntable and because they wanted to hear the records that Dave had brought. And Dave more or less gave them the talk he had meant to give in class, except this time he did it without his notes. This time he did it without worrying about his hands. Kids would have stayed all night, but Dave was tired, so sometime after midnight he left the albums with them and he went to bed. "Get them to me in the morning," he said. He woke early, and he went for a walk across the campus to the river, where he watched the scullers practicing in the smoky morning mist. He sat on the bank, and he felt glad that he had come. Even though the speech had been a disaster, talking with the kids afterwards had been nice. It made him feel good that they wanted to know what he had to say, what he had done with his life. It made him feel good that they saw value in his experience. He got on the train to go home just before lunch, and for the first while he sat quietly and watched the country rock by, the highways and the towns, with their rivers and old stone mills. He waved at some kids holding onto their bikes at a level crossing. He bought a coffee when the porter came by, and then he opened his briefcase and pulled out his Walkman and put on his headsets and slipped in a homemade Beatles tape. Both John and George were gone, but Paul was still here, and he was doing the one sure thing he could do. He was still singing. Dave turned up the volume. Scotty Hornickel was gone. Dave shook his head. They sure had some good times together, laughing, carrying on, doing what they did. He turned the tape up even louder. So what if it would deafen him? The music was making him happy, like it had so many times before. Thank you.